Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome, focus learners. If you're anything like me, you really appreciate when complex history gets broken down into clear, structured facts. In today's explainer, we're taking aim at a massive historical misconception. We are going to completely dismantle the myth of a neat, tidy ending to the American Civil War. Because, when we actually look at the data and the timeline, the end of this massive conflict was messy, prolonged, and incredibly complex.
So, that brings us right to our core question. Did the Civil War really end at Appomattox? If you crack open almost any standard history textbook, the narrative usually just stops on April 9th, 1865. General Robert E. Lee surrenders the Army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant, and boom, the war is effectively declared over. But did it actually end there? Well, the reality, as you'll see as we unpack the source material, is that Lee's surrender merely marked the beginning of the end. It definitely did not immediately stop the conflict.
Just take a look at this timeline. The true conclusion of the war wasn't some quick few days of bureaucratic wrap-up. It was a massive, 16-month-long process. Seriously, 16 months! It stretches from Lee's surrender in April 1865 through the final land surrenders in June, all the way to a naval surrender in November. And incredibly, the official legal peace wasn't even declared until August of 1866. So let's walk through exactly why the whole shebang took so long. To understand the delay, we really have to put ourselves in the physical reality of the 1860s. News traveled agonizingly slowly across a divided, battle-scarred nation. Despite Lee's surrender, there was no instant communication network to inform all the other Confederate armies spread out across the continent. Because of that, skirmishes and major engagements were still raging in the woods and fields. In fact, the Battle of Columbus in Georgia was fought on April 16th. That's a full week after Appomattox. And then, a pivotal event shattered literally any hope of a smooth, predictable surrender process. On April 14, 1865, just days after Appomattox, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. This single, tragic event threw everything into immediate political chaos. The generous, almost lenient tone that Lincoln and Grant had set at Appomattox, that was suddenly wiped out, replaced by intense outrage and grief in Washington. It made the North significantly less forgiving in all the surrender negotiations that followed.
Dominoes in the East, the Bennett Place surrender.
So the Union is now facing this absolute logistical nightmare of stamping out the rebellion's embers across the East, systematically securing the surrender of remaining forces like falling dominoes. Look at this unassuming spot, the Bennett farmhouse near Durham, North Carolina. A negotiation took place right here that was just as critical as Appomattox. This is where Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston met with Union General William T. Sherman to hammer out the cessation of hostilities for a massive chunk of the remaining Southern forces.
So the crucial point is Johnston's capitulation on April 26, 1865 was actually the single largest surrender of the entire war. He handed over more than 30,000 soldiers, covering the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. To put that into perspective, that's a huge swath of the remaining Confederate military power. And what's super fascinating here is that Sherman initially offered Johnston incredibly generous political terms, even more generous than what Grant offered Lee. But remember Lincoln's assassination? Because of that, an outraged Washington completely rejected Sherman's initial terms, forcing Johnston to eventually agree to strictly military terms that mirrored Appomattox. With Johnston finally out of the fight, the remaining dominoes across the South and West just began to fall, step by step. On May 4th, General Richard Taylor surrenders 40,000 troops in Alabama. On May 10th, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who'd actually been on the run, is captured in Georgia, which effectively dissolves the Confederate government. By the time General Kirby Smith formally signs the surrender papers for the Trans-Mississippi Department off Galveston on June 2nd, his command of 60,000 troops had largely disintegrated through mass desertion anyway. The formal armies were literally evaporating. But get this, the absolute final land surrender, that didn't happen until late June. On June 23, 1865, way out in the Choctaw Nation, Confederate General Stand Watie surrendered his command. Watie was a Cherokee leader and officially the last Confederate general in the field to lay down his arms. His surrender, which represented a battalion of Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, and Osage warriors, marked the definitive final end of organized armed land resistance.
The Global Raider, the voyage of the CSS Shenandoah.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the war on land was over, but the conflict was still raging on the high seas. Let's follow the incredibly wild rogue voyage of a Confederate warship called the CSS Shenandoah.
Over the course of a year, this ship logged a staggering 58,000 miles, completely circumnavigating the globe. Originally a Scottish-built merchant ship, it was secretly bought and converted into a Confederate commerce raider with one mission: destroy Union shipping. And because it was thousands of miles away from the American coast, it was completely isolated from any news that the war had actually ended.
This extreme isolation led to a profound, almost tragic irony. On June 22, 1865, months after Lee's surrender, the Shenandoah was way up in the frigid waters of the Bering Sea. Completely unaware that the Confederacy had collapsed, the ship opened fire on the Union whaling fleet. A gunner jerked a wrist strap and fired what would be the literal last shots of the American Civil War, destroying a major portion of the whaling fleet right there in the Arctic Ocean.
The truth finally caught up to the Shenandoah on August 2, 1865. They ran into a British ship, the Barracuda, and Captain James Waddell finally learned the reality: the total collapse of the Confederacy, the capture of Jefferson Davis, and the surrenders of all the Southern armies. He wrote in his log that it was, quote, "the darkest day of my life." Waddell realized with just immense grief that for months he'd been sinking innocent, unarmed ships while his country was actually at peace. Knowing he could be hanged as a pirate in the U.S., he immediately disarmed his ship and set sail straight for England.
This creates such a fascinating contrast. Think about it. The ultimate military surrender of the American Civil War didn't even happen in America. It happened in Liverpool, England. On November 6, 1865, Captain Waddell finally surrendered the Shenandoah to the British Royal Navy. But guess what? Even then, the war wasn't over on paper. Getting to the legal end required a massive bureaucratic process back in Washington, D.C., which brings us all the way to August 1866.
The legal conclusion: President Johnson's proclamations.
To officially conclude the insurrection, we have to shift our focus away from the battlefields and into the bureaucracy of Washington. The military fighting had ceased, sure, but legally speaking, the United States was still in a state of rebellion. President Andrew Johnson actually had to issue formal proclamations to restore civil authority. Take a look at this document from April 2, 1866. It explicitly declares the insurrection suppressed, and the war effectively over in states like Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, and so on. But notice the glaring exception here. Pockets of resistance and complex civil authority issues meant that Texas was intentionally excluded from this April document.
And this brilliantly illustrates the delicate tightrope the government was walking. Dense legal resolutions were absolutely crucial to officially rebuild the Union. Why? Because maintaining standing armies and permanent martial law in times of peace is, well, dangerous to public liberty. The government had to transition these states back to civil authority and political equality to officially close the book on the war. It was a process that required exhaustive legal frameworks, not just brute military force.
And that finally brings us to the definitive date. On August 20, 1866, President Johnson issued a final proclamation that officially included Texas. It declared that the insurrection was entirely at an end and that peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority now exist in and throughout the whole of the United States of America. This specific date, August 20, 1866, is the true official date adopted by the United States courts, executive departments, and Congress as the absolute legal end of the Civil War.
So I want to end this explainer with a provocative question for you to chew on. When the guns fall silent, how long does it take for a war to truly end? As we've explored today, Appomattox was really just a milestone. The true end of the American Civil War was a 16-month, messy, global reality spanning from a quiet farmhouse in North Carolina all the way to the icy waters of the Bering Sea and finally landing on the legal desks of Washington, D.C. It's just a powerful reminder that history is rarely as simple as the headlines suggest. Thank you so much for learning with me today, and hey, keep exploring the incredible complexities of our past.